My name is Stephanie Chisholm, and I'm the Director of Education and Research at the Bladder Cancer Advocacy Network. And I'd like to welcome everybody to our Patient Insight webinar. This particular topic is an update on the BCAN Patient Survey Network. We have two people that will be speaking today. We have Dr. Angela Smith. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Urology at the University of North Carolina. And we do have Dr. John Gore. He'll be joining us. He is an associate professor in the Department of Urology at the University of Washington.
Thank you for joining us today. I wanted to start off with a question. I wanted to know, what if you could tell researchers what questions matter to you? And I think this is important because you have to think back at your clinic visits. If you're a patient in bladder cancer, has there been a time when you had to choose between two options for treatment, when you were trying to figure out your diagnosis, when you really were unsure of the options and even your provider couldn't tell you exactly which way to go? Sometimes there's research that we don't understand, things that we don't know about bladder cancer, that if we did, it would be very helpful to you when you're making your decision. So I want you to think about that as I go through this presentation, because that's really the question that drove this entire project. The problem in terms of how research is currently conducted is generally research is done by scientists who base that research question on their own knowledge of the topic. And whether that is right for the patient is difficult to tell. They use it usually based on their clinical knowledge, what their knowledge of the literature is, but patients are rarely asked what research questions matter to them. They're not generally in the research process when they define their research question and come up with that research idea. And while those research questions may be well-intentioned by the researchers, they may not necessarily reflect the priorities of patients. And as we all know, there are thousands of research questions that could be asked, and we only have a limited amount of money to fund research. So I think it's really important that we figure out which research questions are basically giving us the biggest bang for our buck, especially in terms of what patients are needing to make educated decisions about their treatment. And so currently the problem is there's no infrastructure to link the patients to the communication with researchers. The solution that we had thought about was at least figuring out a way to identify patients and caregivers who were interested in providing their knowledge about bladder cancer and research questions and asking them what research is going to be meaningful to them. And then once we have that idea, we can provide that information to researchers as well as funding organizations. And that's a good way to at least make sure that the research ideas that we're asking are pertinent to our patients and not necessarily something that only the researchers feel that are important. I want to introduce who we are and where this idea came from. Many of you are well aware of the BCAN Annual Think Tank, which is an annual conference of patient advocates, researchers in bladder cancer. And there's a work group called the Patient-Centered Outcomes and Policy Work Group. And that work group has a number of different individuals, including patients, caregivers, physicians, nurses, social workers, payers, research industry. I mean, you name it, it has a very wide variety of individuals who this is important to. And so this concept came out of that work group of the Patient-Centered Outcomes and Policy Work Group. And in essence, all of those individuals in that work group became a steering committee to develop this idea and bring it to life. And fortunately, it was funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. And in doing that, we were able to really attack that problem that I had introduced at the beginning of this webinar. So in a nutshell, this is what we have done, what we've done so far, but I'm going to take you step by step, but this is sort of like an overview, a bird view of what we've done, and then I'll go into the details. So As I mentioned, we first secured the funding from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. That's a 2-year project, and we're now in the 2nd year. And I'm going to give you an update of what we've done this first year. In that year, we were able to develop a network of bladder cancer patients and caregivers of patients with bladder cancer of over 600 participants. We identified unanswered questions about bladder cancer, and we did that based on disease stage, so non-invasive bladder cancer, invasive bladder cancer, and metastatic. And then we delivered those questions back to the patients, to researchers, and funding agencies. But in order to do all those steps, it required a great deal of effort, so I have the work group to thank, as well as all the patients, and of course Stephanie and Alejandra as well. So the first step was recruiting patients and caregivers to join the Patient Survey Network. We did that in a number of ways in terms of advertisement, and many of you on this webinar may recognize some of these efforts. The first was we used Inspire, and that's a great resource because it's a wonderful repository of patients and caregivers, a really good community of bladder cancer advocates who are engaged and interested in making sure that these research questions are what they should be for the bladder cancer population. So we started there advertising to get the word out and to have people join, and that was probably the biggest advertisement we could get, and we got most of our patients in that way. We also did a webinar last year, very similar to this one, except we didn't have any results, and it was more just to get a feel for what patients thought and what we were planning to do. We sent out brochures and postcards about the Patient Survey Network, and then we engaged in social media with Twitter and Facebook, and just made sure that the word got out that way as well. So moving from there, we had our group of patients and caregivers interested in this survey network. We then needed to generate some research questions, and that's hard because there's thousands of research questions out there. And so we did this in a number of ways, but we decided to capitalize on the annual think tank, which has a bunch of, as I mentioned, a bunch of stakeholders, so patients, caregivers, and so forth. And so we asked the individuals at the think tank, what research questions, off the top of their head, what research questions matter to them? And so we essentially just solicited any question that was important, and we took those questions and we fed them back, and we said, okay, here are the questions you came up with. Can you rank order them? What do you think is most important? Because it may be that you had a question, but then when you see some other questions other individuals had brought up, maybe that question rose to the top for you. And so we did that in this sort of group fashion. And then we convened the Patient-Centered Outcomes work group. This is a picture of the group from last year. And a number of patients attended this, and we discussed these questions. And it was a really lively and very good discussion. A lot of the questions that came up were even questions that weren't listed in this group. So I think that just brainstorming and thinking through these questions were important. As an example, I like to share, a patient shared his story about local cystoscopy and the discomfort surrounding local cystoscopy, and how some providers use the lidocaine Urijet, which is a numbing agent before cystoscopy, and some didn't. And that led to questions of how can you better, reduce discomfort with cystoscopy, not something that was necessarily on researchers' mind, but certainly important to patients. And so it's a good example of why the patient voice is important when we're thinking about these research questions, because we researchers generally really think about survival and very hard endpoints like that, but they may not think of other quality of life issues and other questions that just may not be on the forefront of our mind. So that's how we generate some research questions. Of course, we couldn't send out all 20, 30 questions, so we distilled them down to 3 questions for each stage. And so we asked the Patient Survey Network to rank order the 3 questions for each disease stage. And so we added those 3 questions, asked those to be ranked, and then we also allowed free text research questions so that if we missed something important, we could at least get a sense of which research questions may be on people's minds. And that was also very interesting. We held some stakeholder conference calls with members of that patient-centered outcomes group from BCAN, and we made sure that those questions were appropriately worded, and we got a good sense of those questions at that point. So I'll share with you our results. So we had 660 participants in the patient survey network. Those are the individuals who signed up, and 361 responded to the survey, actually ranking these questions. We had good diversity in general in terms of gender and stage. The stage, 64% were the non-invasive, which really mirrors the population, and 25% were muscle invasive and 11% metastatic. So that really mirrored what we normally see in the population. One thing that we really want to improve upon this year is increasing general diversity in terms of race. We had mostly white respondents, and we want to make sure that this survey network reflects the opinions of all patients with bladder cancer. So that is one thing that we're going to be working on in the coming year. So going through each of the different stages, I'll just briefly discuss the top 3 questions. Now, we have a list of the top 20 questions for each stage of disease, and if you're interested in that, that's on the BCAN website, and I'll list that at the end of the webinar. But just focusing on these top 3 for non-invasive bladder cancer, the highest ranked question is shown here in orange, and that was when to undergo bladder removal. And that's a big question for a lot of patients with non-invasive disease who maybe have been through BCG induction and is just not sure whether they should undergo a second round if they recur, or whether they should go straight to bladder removal. The second most highly ranked question was looking at the best medication after treatment failure. And so again, I think that's very similar to that third question, when to undergo bladder removal. What do you do when BCG doesn't work, or what do you do if you were using mitomycin? What can you do next? And so these are important questions, and I think that I understand why they came up to the top of the list. And then the third question was in blue here. The reducing cysto discomfort was ranked first, the least of the 3, but certainly still important in terms of all questions. So I think that was a really interesting assortment of questions. And I'll highlight again that the reducing cysto discomfort came directly from a patient. That was not a question that was solicited by researchers. So again, highlighting the importance of this particular project and making sure that we keep doing this and really get an idea of patients' opinions with regard to research questions. So the next stage of disease that we looked at was muscle invasive bladder cancer. And here, the top ranked question is whether cystectomy is better or bladder sparing treatments, chemoradiation. And that's a burning question. Now, that's a question that even researchers also agree is important to know, because cystectomy can be a life-changing, life-altering surgery, but chemoradiation also has its own side effects. So who is the right patient for chemoradiation versus cystectomy is an important question. The second question that was ranked highly was quality of life among urinary diversions. And that's a really commonly asked question on Inspire, on the patient community website. So I wasn't surprised to see that bubble to the top as well. And then finally, what are the best surveillance strategies after cystectomy? Because in the research world, we really don't have a good sense of how often we should be doing CT scans and if they even are helpful for patients. So we do them generally every 3 to 6 months, depending on the patient, but should we be doing them less often? Are there certain studies that are better than others? And so that also came to the surface. For metastatic bladder cancer, these are the 3 questions that came up here. And the highest ranked was this first question comparing survival, side effects, and quality of life for different types of chemo in this setting. And I think that's important because quality of life with metastatic bladder cancer, if the chemo is, if you're going to have very similar survival between 2 types of chemotherapy and the quality of life is drastically different, I think that's an important thing that patients need to know. The next highly ranked question is looking at the benefits of cystectomy with chemo versus chemo alone. Traditionally, we do chemo alone for metastatic bladder cancer, but we sometimes do cystectomy as well as chemotherapy. So what are the benefits and drawbacks of that approach? And then the final question was timing of palliative care, and that was ranked third. And I wonder if it's because palliative care that the term is difficult to understand, or at least not a term that's commonly used. I think it's confusing even for urologists and for medical oncologists in understanding exactly what that means. But I think it's an important question, and we did try to provide some definitions along the way with these surveys. But this is why I want to hear from you at the end of this webinar how we can do better and how we can reach more people and make sure this is understandable. So those were the research questions that came out of this project for this prior year. And the last step was to disseminate those questions, because it's all well and good that we have them, but what are we going to do with them? How are we going to get them answered? And I know that's the question that really comes up from the patient perspective. And so the first thing we did was feed those questions back to you. So every member of the Patient Survey Network should have received an email that provided that list, and also it was advertised on BCAN. We also, on the researcher side, we wanted to make sure that they were also aware of these questions. And so the way that we're disseminating those questions is by talking with a variety of funding agencies. I've already talked to PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and they are thinking about looking at some of these questions potentially for funding. The NCI, National Cancer Institute, I also spoke with them, and they're aware of these questions. And then ARC, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is another large funding agency. All of these agencies are important because when they look at these research topics coming through, they can have a knowledge of what research question matter to the patient. So if they have several research questions that they're trying to decide between, this is a really good way for them to decide and prioritize which one should get funding. And so I think that this is going to be a really good partnership with these agencies. And then from a researcher standpoint, we plan to publish this in a journal, and we're working on that manuscript now, talking about what we've done and how it could be potentially mirrored in other cancer sites, and then also publishing these listed questions so that when researchers are thinking about those ideas, they can go to this list and make sure that these questions are rising to the surface in terms of their thoughts as well. So I end with, why does this matter? And I hope that I've conveyed this in some way throughout this webinar, but I think it's really important to understand that some of these research questions, while patients aren't researchers and we don't expect you to be research questions, you are experts in bladder cancer because of your experiences. And so new research questions are going to come up just by virtue of you telling your story and thinking about those questions that were left unanswered when you were going through your bladder cancer journey. And the second reason this matters is that this creates a registry of engaged patients, and that's important. The way that we do research traditionally is, we have the idea, and then the researcher goes through their research design, they, create the clinical trial, then they ask for patients' involvement in essentially enrolling in that trial. But where we're trying to go is really getting patients engaged at the very beginning. Wouldn't it be nice if a patient was involved in the design? Maybe the patient could say, well, listen, you want to have these number of patients, and this is how you're going to reach them. In my experience, when I was undergoing treatment, there's no way that I could have enrolled in that trial because of this reason or that reason. And so you may have, as a patient, a different perspective of a better way to do that research. So again, I want to emphasize that even though a patient may not be an expert in the actual research process, they're an expert in the bladder cancer treatment, in their own treatment, their experiences, and how to reach bladder cancer patients. And so having that registry of engaged patients will allow researchers to connect with those patients. and ask them questions and get involved in a way that can improve the entire research infrastructure and make it very valuable for everyone involved. So our ultimate goal, what do we want to get out of this? Well, ideally, even though this is a 2-year project, I want this to be an annual project that goes on an ongoing basis. So creating a sustainable method to conduct this research prioritization with bladder cancer patients. And so that's where we want to be. Where are we going in the future? Well, this year, we're going to be continuing to grow the patient survey network. So if you know of someone who's not in the network, I know that we did the poll and some of you are not, please join. I think it would be wonderful to have you involved and help participate in the survey and also participate in other research in the future. So the second thing is to focus on the diversity, and that's something I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that we really want to make sure that all voices are heard, and so we're focusing on that as well. We want more feedback from you, and I'm really interested in any questions at the end of this webinar or suggestions of how we can improve this process, how we can improve this overall. And I'd be willing to hear that at the webinar, but if you want to email us, call us, that would be wonderful. And then we're going to present questions at the annual think tank very similarly to how we did last year, but we're going to make some adjustments based on patient feedback. And then we're going to create an annual plan to continue disseminating these bladder cancer research questions, the one that we feel are important, as defined by not only researchers, but also the patients and caregivers. So I leave you with this quote: healthcare is at the beginning of a dialogue with the world. As healthcare providers, we have to ask ourselves this question: what stories are we not hearing? And this quote makes me think about the importance of this project. There's a lot of stories in bladder cancer that we don't hear if we only listen to the researchers. Yes, they have experience in the clinical realm, they have experience in research, but they themselves do not have bladder cancer. And so that's the story that's missing. And so the piece of the puzzle here is the patient and the caregiver of patients who have bladder cancer. So I leave you with this slide: how can you get involved? If you've already signed up last year, we're going to be sending you out a survey to update your information, because I know things change. Your bladder cancer stage may have changed, and we may ask another 1 or 2 questions. If you haven't signed up, this is the website to join. You don't necessarily have to write it down. If you go to the BCAN website, you can actually search Patient Survey Network. Even if you Google Patient Survey Network with BCAN, it will take you to this page and sign up. It's very easy, very quick. And in September, you're going to receive another link to a survey, something that we did just like last year, where we're going to ask you to rank the top 3 questions and include questions of your own. And finally, I again urge you to spread the word, because the more patients we have in this network, I think the stronger it'll become and the more impact it will have. And so again, with any questions, this is the number to call, and the email, the psn@beacon.org. You can call the number 301-215-9099. And finally, I want to thank you for joining us in the webinar. I want to thank all of the patients in the survey network who joined and who created the survey or completed the survey, as well as Stephanie and BCAN, and as well as John and the rest of the work group through BCAN.
Have any of these questions been tackled by any researchers, or if you can explain sort of where that process of letting researchers know is going and where we're at specifically?
Sure.
I want to know, have they done anything about this? Are they considering adding these to current research studies?
Great question, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. I mean, it's all well and good to have a list of questions, but if we're not doing anything with them, really our efforts are in vain. So research takes a while, I'll say that. So I think that a lot of these questions have not yet been tackled, because we just came up with the list at not that long ago. But I will say that a couple things of interest have come up. First of all, I spoke with this funding agency, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. They recently published a listing of research questions, okay, that essentially identified the gaps in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. And so they're interested in kind of combining those gaps with the questions that came up from patients. And so we're in the midst of combining those and creating that. So we're not there yet in terms of answering all of them, but I think that when we combine that and when ARC provides that list to researchers, it's going to urge researchers to tackle those questions. One thing that John and I were speaking about together in terms of us tackling one of these questions, one of the interesting questions was looking at reducing discomfort during BCG treatment, because many patients with high-risk non-muscle invasive bladder cancer have discomfort with BCG, and that can be long-standing, and what are the best ways to reduce that? And if there's a way that we can answer that question using some of the research infrastructure we have, we've started thinking about ways to answer that question and reaching out to individuals and to organizations that will allow us to have a patient repository to study that question, not just at one institution, but across institutions. So a long answer to your question, but I think it's a little too early to actually have an answer to any of these questions, but I do see that we are moving ahead with using some of these questions and starting the research process. So I think that's progress, and I'm really happy that we're already there after just a short few months of getting the list.
I'm glad to see that the matter of urinary diversions came up at number 2 for muscle-invasive bladder cancer research. I would urge that special attention be paid to the different experiences of men and women. As a newly diagnosed woman, T2, facing surgery and diversion choice, I see little data that doesn't fold men and women together, even though we have very different experiences with and expectations for diversion. Disaggregating data by gender is important. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that and how we might incorporate that into some of the feedback we provide?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really excellent point. And in fact, I just published a systematic review which essentially looks at all of the literature of bladder cancer diversions. And I published one looking directly at gender-specific outcomes. And my conclusion in that systematic review, where I looked at all that literature, is exactly what that participant just mentioned, is that most of these studies consolidate men and women, yet they are completely different individuals in terms of anatomy, in terms of types of procedures, and so we have very little evidence to go by to accurately counsel women with bladder cancer undergoing cystectomy and diversion. And so I think that that is an important question, and I think that the way that that needs to be answered is a concerted effort by researchers to specifically report gender-based outcomes so that we have a better idea of the percentage of incontinence, for example, for neobladders, or body image issues for either. And right now we're not there, and we certainly can do much better. And I think that there are other ways to do that in terms of registries and pooling of data, because as I'm sure this participant is aware of, bladder cancer among women is less common than men, and so it's harder to study because there's not as many patients. So, I know personally I'm well aware of that issue, but I think a project like this highlights it. And when we highlight that to researchers, then we can do better. We can make sure that the way that we conduct the research addresses it. So it's a really good point, and thank you for bringing it up. John, would you add anything to that?
No, I think one of our challenges has always been the disproportion in the number of men and women getting cystectomies, and so women have always been dangerously underrepresented in reports about urinary diversions, and so a mindfulness about gender-specific differences is really critical.
If not already done, I would suggest that those organizing and administrating the patient survey network include people of color as well as whites. This could help increase the diversity of the program, which speaks very much to what you said, Dr. Smith, at the beginning of the program, in our goal of really trying to really reflect the patient population and be more diverse. And absolutely, I would suggest that if any of the participants on the call have suggestions, so please email me. It's schism@beacon.org, and you'll get an email from me tomorrow. But if you have any ideas, and I know, Dr. Smith, if you or Dr. Gore, if you've thought of any other ways of increasing the diversity in the PSN that you want to share?
Yeah, I think, Stephanie, I mean, I agree. I mean, if there are any ideas out there from patients on how to do that, I could not agree more. That was our entire goal of this year, is really to increase that diversity so that the patient survey network is representative. We don't want it representing only one particular patient population. And so if there's an idea of how to extend that reach, I would be all ears for that. We have money that we can use to enact some ideas if there are any out there. I know that we're going to be trying on social media to provide ideas and just the knowledge that bladder cancer is not something that just affects an old white male. And I think that's a common misconception. It affects women as well. It affects younger individuals. It affects people of color. It affects everyone. And we need to make sure that we're at least advertising that, making sure that that anyone and everyone is invited to this network. And so, again, if there are ideas out there of how to better extend this reach, I'm all ears and would love to hear the suggestions.
What percentage of patients do not respond to chemo? The answer is very important for patients who choose whether to have neoadjuvant chemo as opposed to having surgery first.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that was a suggestion for a question.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I'm writing it down right now.
I'll send these to you in the final report, because I'll get all of these questions in the final webinar report. Dr. Have all
Great.
of that. And then as follow-up, this neoadjuvant chemo choice is particularly important to patients with high-risk muscle-invasive, say, T2 or 3. So, very good point. That was a question from one of the participants.
No, I just want to thank everybody for attending tonight, and I also just want to reiterate that this is a project that has gotten where it is from patient input, and so I know that we can improve with additional patient input. So I really do encourage you to let us know any suggestions in the future. If you know of any patients, caregivers of patients with bladder cancer, to encourage them to join the network and then respond to the survey. We'll certainly be mindful about not wasting your time, not sending out too many surveys. Really, it's just going to be one to update your information, and then a single survey to rank the questions. And so if you can remember that in September when you see that email, and encourage your friends, and if you could also respond to that survey, I think that we'll get a really good idea of what's important to the bladder cancer community. So again, thank you for attending. I really appreciate it.
And remember, if you have any other questions, please send them to psn@bcan.org.